The sharp crack of a perfect shot rang through the air inside the elite shooters club, echoing against polished wooden walls lined with mounted trophies. A target slid back across its track, showing a perfect bullseye, and the room erupted with thunderous claps from men and women clad in custom shooting gear that cost more than most people's annual salaries. At the center of their admiration stood Blake Radcliffe, Olympic gold medalist, 5-time national champion, and heir to an oil fortune so hefty it made his cocky grin look almost justified. This was his domain, his private kingdom where talent and arrogance met money and exclusivity. "Beautiful shot, sir," one patron exclaimed. Blake lowered his custom Remington rifle with a lazy flourish, basking in the validation as if the applause were oxygen. He smirked confidently, scanning the room for anyone else foolish enough to challenge him. By the entrance, however, no one was clapping. Emma Miller stood there, adjusting the strap of her worn leather purse, her department store jeans and faded cardigan immediately setting her apart from the sea of designer gear and logo-patched jackets. She looked like a misplaced librarian among professional athletes. At 35, Emma carried no obvious aura of power, no sharp heels, no expensive jewelry, only quiet composure and a hint of hesitation as she waited at the reception desk. The blonde receptionist barely glanced at her. "Membership cards only," she intoned flatly, her smile so mechanical it almost squeaked. I have a day pass," Emma replied, producing a crinkled envelope. It was a gift. Across the room, Blake caught sight of her. Like a predator spotting prey, his lips curled into a smirk. He raised his voice so the room could hear. Well, looks like someone took a wrong turn on the way to Walmart." His companions burst into laughter on cue, as if rehearsed. Emma said nothing. She simply adjusted her purse strap and walked toward the most basic shooting range, keeping her eyes to the floor. Rebecca Johnson, the club manager, frowned from her station near the office. A former competitive shooter herself, Rebecca knew cruelty when she heard it, but years under the elite had taught her caution. Speaking against Blake Radcliffe meant risking reputation and career. Still, something about the way Emma kept her dignity despite the insult tugged at Rebecca's conscience. Emma quietly unpacked a bundle wrapped in cloth. The sleek reveal of her firearm drew another snicker from Blake's group. A Glock 19 plain, ordinary, serviceable, and utterly unimpressive among custom gold-plated firearms studded with optics and silencers. $10 says she can't even hit the target, one of Blake's friends jeered. Blake's laughter was louder. "Make it $10,000. I bet she's never fired in her life." He sauntered towards her lane, his presence larger than life, dripping mock politeness. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, tone so false it was practically edible. "Are you sure you're in the right place? Usually knitting circles meet in the next building." Emma finally looked up and met his eyes. Her gaze was calm, those hazel eyes holding a depth that momentarily threw him off his performance. "I'm just here to practice," she said softly. Blake chuckled. "Practice? This is where professionals come to perfect their art. I'll make it interesting. $10,000 says you can't hit the bullseye at 50 yards. "I don't have that kind of money," Emma replied evenly. Her voice was controlled, almost too calm, and it unsettled him more than a nervous protest would have. Blake grinned wider. "Don't worry, sweetheart. If by some miracle you hit it, I'll pay. If you miss, you walk out and never come back." Rebecca appeared by Emma's side, concern evident. "Mr. Radcliffe, let her be. She's here on a guest pass." "Stay out of it, Rebecca," Blake dismissed sharply, eyes never leaving Emma. "It's just a little friendly fun." Emma's gaze dropped to her left hand, twisting the simple gold wedding band around her finger. For one small moment she remembered the only man who had ever believed she was extraordinary. Then she nodded. "All right." Blake blinked, momentarily surprised at her acceptance. Then his smirk returned. "Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems we've got ourselves a show." A crowd started gathering, anticipation thick in the air. Blake motioned grandly toward Emma, milking the spectacle. The poor anonymous woman versus the celebrated superstar. What no one noticed was Emma's subtle transformation. Her shoulders lowered, her spine straightened, her hands wrapped around the Glock with impeccable familiarity, locking into perfect grip. Her stance shifted, not clumsy civilian but balanced precision. Her breathing became measured, slow, steady. Because Emma Miller wasn't merely a widow with a day pass, She carried in her the legacy of Master Chief Nathan the Ghost Miller, SEAL Team 6 sniper. And though every civilian had overlooked her since his death 3 years ago, Nathan's training still lived inside her like muscle memory written in bone. She raised the Glock, sighted the target, and in the ringing silence that fell over the range, let her breath settle halfway. With calm beyond the sneer and laughter aimed at her, she squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked, crisp and clean. The retrieval machine hummed loudly in the silence as the target slid forward. Blake tried to appear amused, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed unease. He had noted her posture, her form, her textbook perfect stance. The target reached the crowd. Gasps spread. A perfect hole marked the exact center, bullseye. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Absolute silence. Emma set down her Glock calmly, her face composed as if she'd done something as ordinary as sip her coffee. Blake rushed forward, snatching the paper as if his disbelief could erase the evidence. He squinted and shook his head. "Beginner's luck," he barked. "Anyone can get lucky once." Rebecca stepped forward, unable to remain silent any longer. "That wasn't luck, Blake. That was skill." She turned toward Emma, her usual professional mask cracked just enough to show admiration. "Miss Miller," Emma supplied quietly. "Miss Miller," Rebecca corrected gently with a respectful nod. "That was an exceptional shot." Emma gave a ghost of a smile, but Blake was already barking again. "One bullseye proves nothing. Let's see her repeat it." His voice wavered with anger, but underneath was something new, something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Because for the first time, Blake Radcliffe had seen someone on this range who didn't belong to his world, yet might just be capable of toppling it. And Emma Miller, quiet, invisible, underestimated, had just taken her first step from anonymity into legend with a single perfect shot. Emma left the Elite Shooters Club that evening drained but strangely alive, her pulse still echoing with the crisp memory of that single perfect shot. She hadn't walked in to make a scene. In truth, she had avoided shooting ranges ever since Nathan's funeral, carrying his medals and his memory like weights she wasn't ready to set down. But here she was now, after 3 years of grief-induced exile, her hands steady, her breath even, as if her husband's voice had guided her stance from beyond. That flicker of something deep inside her was unsettling but undeniable. A feeling long dormant had reawakened. She thought she had buried it with Nathan, but in facing Blake Radcliffe's arrogance, it stirred again. Not rage exactly, but a defiance. A whisper saying, "You promised him. Don't stop now." At home that night, she opened the wooden box she had kept sealed since Arlington. Medals, folded letters, a wedding photograph, and Nathan's logbooks. She traced her finger along his handwriting, each note as precise as his shots. Entries on her training leapt out. Emma, 50 yards, 9-10 bullseyes, steady hand, remarkable calmness under stress. Reading his words now, her chest tightened with an ache that was somehow both painful and strengthening. She remembered the night before his final mission when Nathan had looked at her with uncharacteristic gravity and said, "Promise me you'll keep practicing, even if I'm not here. It's not just about skill. It's about control, about peace." At the time, she hadn't understood his urgency. Now it made sense. He had wanted her to have more than protection. He wanted her to find steadiness in a world full of chaos. The following morning, for the first time in 3 years, Emma phoned Meridian Financial and called in sick. Her colleagues would be shocked. Emma was reliable to the point of predictability. But instead of an office building, she drove 2 hours to a small public shooting range far removed from Boston's elites.
She unpacked Nathan's Glock with reverence and began to practice.
The sounds of gunfire around her no longer sent pangs of grief. Instead, they carried rhythm. Every shot was a memory, every stance a conversation with the man who had once guided her shoulders and whispered corrections into her ear. For 8 hours she drilled, sight alignment, trigger control, breathing. By day's end, the numb ache in her arms and the ringing in her ears felt like medicine. Exhaustion was proof she was keeping her promise. Blake, meanwhile, was not sleeping well. That bullseye haunted him, looping again and again in his mind like a glitch on repeat. He had mocked Emma, expecting to showcase his superiority. Instead, she had embarrassed him in front of Boston's elite. His reputation wasn't built only on precision but on dominance, on being untouchable. Now, a woman with no reputation, no credentials, had walked in with a department store sweater and erased his aura in one shot. He told himself it was luck. He said it aloud in his penthouse that overlooked the Charles River, whiskey glass clutched tight. But deep inside, he recognized something in her stance, her technique, the grace of military training. That thought made his chest tighten in anger and unease. Obsession began to bloom. By midweek, Rebecca Johnson called Emma quietly. "Blake has people digging into your background," she said with worry. "He's convinced you cheated somehow. He can make things very difficult for you in this city." Emma merely thanked her. She had nothing to hide. Her life was open record ordinary. An accountant, a widow, a woman who kept to herself. Yet when she hung up, Emma understood what Blake was really trying to do, shake her, frighten her into withdrawal. She had spent years being afraid of phone calls with bad news, of folded flags and empty beds. This wasn't fear. This was noise. And she was resolved not to break. On Thursday, her resolution was tested when a messenger arrived at her door with details. The formal duel was now sanctioned, extended to 10 shooting stations with 10 different firearms, some exotic military grade, and specialized weapons no civilian accountant had any business handling. Blake had restructured the challenge to expose her, to prove she lacked range. Rebecca again called afterward, whispering her suspicion. "He's stacking the deck. If you lose to him across unfamiliar weapons, the crowd will believe you were a one-hit wonder." Emma listened carefully before replying in her soft, steady tone. "Let him stack it. If I know one thing, it's how to adapt." Later that day, Emma opened Nathan's logbook again, noting his calculations, his advice scribbled in margins. Equipment fails. Conditions change. Adapt and overcome. She practiced those words the next day at another range, where she rented every different type of weapon she could, drilling fundamentals across platforms until her shoulders ached. She wasn't flashy. She didn't try tricks. Instead, she trusted the discipline Nathan had instilled in her. Calmness, patience, precision. With each shot, she felt more like herself, or more like the woman Nathan had always believed she could be. Every target hole was not proof to others, but to herself that she was still alive, still fighting, still honoring his memory. Blake's investigator finally returned with news from Virginia Beach. Nathan Miller, Navy SEAL, call sign The Ghost, a name whispered with reverence among special forces. A sniper who had hit targets others couldn't even see. And Emma, his widow. Worse, Emma had been trained directly by him. That revelation twisted Blake's stomach. The narrative he'd planned, an amateur fraud exposed by a champion, collapsed in an instant. Instead, the press could turn it into the story of a fallen hero's widow outshooting the arrogant champion. Blake's pride stung sharper than gunpowder. His jaw clenched as he told himself, "Experience wins over sentiment. Wealth over tragedy. I will not lose," but across town, Emma wasn't thinking of reputation or narrative. She was sitting with Nathan's medals laid on her kitchen table, sipping tea and feeling something shift profoundly. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't the grieving widow defined by loss. She was a woman stepping back into the world on her own terms, carrying his strength through her hands. Each practice session awakened her further, from grief to purpose, from hesitation to quiet confidence. Quietly, Emma Miller, once invisible, was preparing not just for a duel with Blake Radcliffe, but for the moment her silence would finally prove louder than his entire empire of noise. By the time the official announcement of the competition circulated, the Elite Shooters Club felt less like a private arena and more like a coliseum, every member buzzing with gossip about the mysterious accountant who had humiliated their golden boy. Blake Radcliffe had ensured that this would not be a casual duel.
He had lobbied the board to transform it into a sanctioned event. 10 stations, 10 firearms,
Distances ranging from close-quarter accuracy to long-range trials with specialized rifles that most civilians had never touched. The word fairness was sprinkled throughout the announcement, but everyone knew the rules were designed with one intention: to crush Emma Miller under the weight of complexity. Blake's skill set had been forged in decades of tournaments where variety and stage pressure were common. Emma's background, at least on paper, was nothing. It was the perfect trap, or so he thought. Emma read the amended rules with quiet composure. For a moment, she considered walking away. Her promise to Nathan hadn't been about humiliating others or entering high-profile contests. It was simply to keep practicing, to remain sharp and alive. But then she thought of Blake's sneer, of his mocking dismissal of wrong turns to Walmart, of the way his influence silenced even Rebecca. More than that, she thought of other faces. Ordinary people dismissed, underestimated, trampled because they didn't wear wealth like armor. Maybe her fight was no longer just about honoring Nathan's memory, but about representing all the invisible ones who had been laughed out of places like this. With that realization, her hesitation gave way to the same steady focus Nathan had recognized in her years ago. Rebecca sought her out the next evening, lowering her voice as she passed Emma a discreet folder. "I shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, "but you deserve to know. The equipment at several stations is being adjusted. Different trigger pulls, misaligned scopes. Subtle enough that only someone with advanced knowledge could prepare for it. It's not official sabotage, but..." She trailed off, letting the implication hang. Emma absorbed the information silently. Of course Blake would not risk losing cleanly. "Thank you," Emma said finally. "Nathan always said equipment changes are part of the fight. Adapt and overcome." Rebecca's expression softened, conflicted admiration in her eyes. "Whoever you are, Ms. Miller, you don't shoot like an accountant. You shoot like someone forged under pressure." Emma offered the smallest of smiles. I suppose he made sure of that. Meanwhile, Blake had turned his obsession into a full-time crusade. He paced his penthouse at midnight, replaying grainy footage of Emma's shots, pointing out to anyone who would listen the textbook stance that screamed military training. His investigator delivered the final blow. Emma Miller was the widow of Master Chief Nathan Miller, U.S. Navy SEAL sniper known among his peers as the Ghost. Blake's teeth clenched as he listened to the briefing. That explained everything. That also meant the narrative had shifted dangerously against him. The crowd would no longer see her as a novice fluke. They would see her as the grieving widow of a fallen hero, keeping his memory alive through marksmanship. In the court of public opinion, she had already won half the battle. Blake found himself rattled in a way he hadn't been since boyhood, when coaches told him raw skill meant nothing without discipline. His response was predictable: double down. He demanded more changes to the event format, weighting final stations heavily toward the long-range Macmillan TASI 338 rifle, a platform in which he was uniquely experienced, one of only a handful of civilian owners in the region. If she had mastered handguns under her husband, so be it. He would drag her into unfamiliar territory where comfort turned into chaos. Emma, though shaken when Rebecca relayed the new scoring adjustments, refused to bow. "So the final deciding stage just happens to involve Blake's favorite long-range rifle," she said calmly. "That's fine. Then I'll learn." Her opportunity came sooner than expected. At a specialized range outside the city, as she prepared to rent time with high-powered rifles, she was approached by a man with a soldier's gait and calm authority etched into his posture. "Mrs. Miller?" he asked politely. "Commander Wilson. Team 3. I served with Nathan in Baghdad in '16. Emma studied him, skeptical but recognizing the authenticity in his mannerisms. Wilson continued evenly. "We weren't in the same squad, but everyone knew the Ghost. He was one of a kind. He talked about you, you know. Said you had the calmest hands of anyone he'd trained. That's why I'm here. I heard what's happening and I thought maybe a little guidance could help." For the next 4 hours, he coached Emma on the nuances of the Macmillan TAC 338, how to account for its tricky recoil, how to adjust for wind patterns at distance, how to trust the scope without overcorrecting. She practiced tirelessly, applying Nathan's familiar fundamentals: steady breathing, relaxed shoulders, patience between shots, while absorbing the differences in scale. Each shot tightened into precision, until even at long distances the impacts clustered near center. Wilson observed quietly, eventually handing her a small notebook Nathan had left with teammates during a mission. Inside were meticulous formulas, calculations for distance, wind, humidity, the science of what Nathan had embodied as instinct. Emma's throat tightened as she accepted the notebook with reverent hands. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. Wilson's gaze shifted, carrying the weight of soldiers who had buried brothers. "Because when you lose someone like Nathan, you protect what mattered to him. And you, Mrs. Miller, mattered to him." That night, Emma sat with Nathan's words by lamplight, running her fingers over the notes he had scratched during deployments far from home. For years she had resisted reopening this part of herself because it hurt too much. Now, channeling his logic and formulas, she felt something different, not grief, but connection. The more she studied, the calmer she became. She wasn't stepping into Blake's trap blindly anymore. She was walking with Nathan, whispering through every equation. Across the city, Blake rehearsed his smile in the mirror, practicing charm for sponsors while inside he roiled with dread. Jessica, his longtime partner, watched him with a mixture of concern and disillusionment. "Blake," she said carefully, "maybe it's time to walk away. This isn't about the money anymore. It's about a woman honoring her husband's memory, and everyone can see that. Do the right thing, pay the charity, let it go." Blake's glare sliced through her. "I don't lose. Do you hear me? I don't lose to amateurs, to accountants, to anyone." When she didn't answer, he turned back to the mirror, muttering under his breath, "This is mine. It always has been. And if the rules aren't enough, I'll have insurance." As the sun rose on the eve of competition, the Elite Shooters Club was transformed. Cameras were rigged, digital scoreboards erected, and rows of chairs filled with members and outsiders alike. Attendance was triple the usual. Everyone wanted to witness the duel between the arrogant champion and the unknown widow. Emma arrived quietly, a duffel bag containing only Nathan's notebook slung on her shoulder. She exchanged a nod with Michael Reeves, one of Nathan's old teammates, seated near the back with several veterans. Their presence steadied her. Rebecca intercepted at the door, whispering urgently, "He's changed the weighting again. The final station counts for 30% of the total." And her eyes flicked with unease. "There are irregularities in some of the firearms. Nothing I can formally raise, but enough to discourage anyone unprepared." Emma listened, then inhaled deeply. Her voice was soft but sure. "Then I'll adapt." For Blake, today was meant to be his restoration ceremony, sealing both his pride and position. For Emma, it had become something greater. Not just about a promise to Nathan anymore, but about confronting arrogance with quiet strength. The stage was set. The rules were stacked. Sabotage lurked in the shadows. But Emma Miller, once invisible, had steel in her spine and the calm of a soldier's widow in her hands. The Elite Shooters Club had never been so alive. Rows of neatly arranged folding chairs transformed the usually hushed members-only sanctuary into the atmosphere of a sporting arena. Digital screens flashed names, scores, and sponsors. Reporters lingered with long lenses and recorders, hungry for scandal or glory. By late morning, the air buzzed with tension. For many, this wasn't just another competition. It was entertainment. It was spectacle. But for Emma Miller, it was something much deeper. A test of patience, discipline, and the quiet fire that had kept her living long after grief had hollowed her inside. She walked in modestly dressed, jeans and a button-down shirt, carrying only a duffel bag that held Nathan's notebook and a water bottle. No endorsements, no contrived swagger. Yet as she made her way to the registration desk, heads turned, there was something magnetic in her calm demeanor, a centeredness that cut through the chaos of cameras and whispers. From the corner of her eye, she saw them. Veterans in the back, men with weathered faces and the unmistakable bearing of soldiers. Michael Reeves was there, Nathan's old friend, giving her a nod both solemn and encouraging. Moments earlier, she had felt a sliver of doubt. Now it melted away. Blake's entrance, by contrast, was pure theater. He arrived surrounded by entourage and sponsors, his gear gleaming with polished logos, his stance exuding the arrogance of a man who had never once entertained the possibility of losing. He shook hands, offered flashes of his perfect smile to cameras, and embraced the spectacle, basking in the lavish spotlight. When his gaze finally landed on Emma, however, his smile thinned. "Ms. Miller," he said as he approached, just loud enough for microphones nearby to pick up, "I trust you're prepared. The pressure can break people, you know, especially those who don't belong here." Emma met his gaze steadily. "My husband taught me how to perform under pressure," she replied. Her tone wasn't sharp, but it cut straight to the marrow. Blake's jaw flexed, his smirk restored, but with less conviction. The first station began. A simple short-range drill with a standard handgun. Blake was flawless, rapid, and theatrical, pausing after each bullseye to allow a camera shutter's punctuation. Emma stepped to the line, raising the firearm with deliberate calm. She fired with no drama, every shot measured like clockwork. 10 rounds, 10 silhouettes punched clean. The scoreboard showed both competitors tied, much to Blake's silent frustration. Station after station, the pattern repeated. Blake dazzled with speed, confidence, flair. Emma countered with stability, consistency, balance. She didn't rush, didn't showcase, didn't break rhythm, and that was her power. At the third station, involving a pump-action shotgun, subtle sabotage was revealed. The recoil was harsher than expected. Emma remembered Rebecca's warning and Nathan's words, "Equipment will fail. Adapt and overcome." She adjusted mid-sequence, using core strength and counterbalance instead of brute arm force. Her target ended close to Blake's score. Not better, not worse even. The crowd, expecting her to fumble, leaned forward with admiration. By Station 5, tension thickened. Emma's stillness unsettled Blake. He fed on declaration, on domination. She fed on silence. Every time she calmly hit her mark, his frustration grew. He found himself overcompensating, forcing his rhythm faster, unnerved by the gathering whispers in the crowd. Whenever she lifted Nathan's Glock, Rebecca's eyes softened from the side. Recognizing that Emma wasn't there for trophies, she was embodying something far more profound. The 8th station ended with nearly identical tallies. By now the audience was divided, half enthralled by Blake's cultivated supremacy, the other half stunned by the quiet accountant who refused to flinch. When the 9th station concluded, the scoreboard officially declared them tied. The decisive test rested entirely on the final challenge, the Macmillan TAC 338 long-range rifle, weighted heavily in the scoring at Blake's request. Spectators leaned forward as if history itself waited behind the trigger. Blake adjusted the rifle with practiced ease. He treated the weapon like an extension of himself, his confidence radiating in every controlled breath. 1, 2, 3. The cracks rang steady, bullets punching through the rings almost mechanically. 9 out of 10 were within the innermost circle, a near-perfect display. When he rose from the bench, applause swelled. Blake bowed his head slightly, soaking in the validation. His expression said, "Let's see you match that, widow." Emma took her place without fanfare. Sitting behind the long rifle, she immediately noticed Rebecca's earlier warning. The scope alignment was slightly off, the stock slightly manipulated, deliberate tampering only possible by those who had prepared ahead. Instead of panic, she inhaled and remembered Nathan's notebook. She flipped it on the bench, his handwritten formulas clear as sunlight, distances calculated, wind adjustments and deviations penned crisp in margins. She whispered under her breath, "Adapt and overcome." Then she adjusted the math on paper and through her fingers, realigning not only the scope, but her mind. Her first shot rang out. Dead center. The crowd gasped. Her second, her third, her fourth. Each mirrored the last, holes cutting into the bullseye so precisely that the paper target seemed to shrink. By the 6th, the crowd had stopped whispering. By the 8th, applause began punctuating each echo. For the 9th, she twisted her wedding band once, centering her soul as she always had before she pulled a trigger. And for the 10th, she exhaled with absolute calm and let the shot fly. Time felt suspended. Then the paper target reeled back, showing a cluster of perfect hits, a string of 10 consecutive bullseyes. The silence was thunderous. Then the room erupted. Shouts, applause, a chorus of disbelief and awe filled the hall. Rebecca stepped forward, displaying the verified target for the cameras and the crowd to see. 10 holes, all nested perfectly together in the center. Emma Miller, widow of the Ghost, had executed a performance none of them would soon forget. Blake's face had gone pale, his smile frozen into something brittle. He stepped forward, voice loud, shrill, straining against the tide turning all around him. "This is impossible. She rigged the setup, she cheated, Enough!" Rebecca's voice cut across the frenzy. She lifted her tablet, tapping the video log from the security system. The footage displayed one of Blake's advisors meddling with equipment in the prep room. Her gaze was steady as she raised her head. Tampering with firearms, not to her benefit, but to her detriment. And still, she won. The hall fell silent again, now heavy not with suspense but humiliation, all of it pressing down on Blake Radcliffe. Emma lowered her weapon, calm as ever, and met his stare. "We had an agreement, Mr. Radcliffe, $50,000 to the Veterans Support Foundation." The way she said it, level and unshaken, echoed like the ringing of her final shot. For a man who measured pride in trophies, it was a clean, devastating kill shot to his ego. Blake tried to protest again, but the voices of onlookers drowned him out. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras flashed. The narrative had rewritten itself before his eyes. Not the untouchable champion, but the bitter fraud caught sabotaging a widow who had performed flawlessly. By the time Emma left the hall, the crowd rose spontaneously. Not with polite claps, but a full standing ovation. 1,000 voices carried one truth. The invisible woman had not only stepped into the light, but outshone the man who believed no one could touch him. By Sunday morning, the story had already slipped beyond the gilded walls of the elite shooters club and out into the world. Grainy video clips of Emma's calm precision were everywhere. 10 perfect hits, each one cleaner than the last, followed by Blake Radcliffe's public collapse. The press had seized it like oxygen to flame. Champion exposed. Widow of Navy SEAL outshoots Golden Boy. Emma woke to dozens of missed calls, texts, emails from journalists, sponsors, and strangers whose curiosity had turned into fascination. Her small apartment kitchen, once cocooned in silence, buzzed with the weight of an unwanted spotlight. She sipped tea in the quiet corners, letting the world storm outside, reminding herself that she had not stepped into this fight for fame, but for a promise whispered years ago by a man who never came home. Meanwhile, Blake spiraled. In his penthouse overlooking the Charles River, the pristine walls now felt like prison bars closing in. Sponsors withdrew statements of support one by one. Endorsements evaporated. Old rivals laughed louder than they ever had before. His publicist suggested a carefully worded apology, donation, perhaps even a staged retreat to a wellness rehab to manage pressure. Blake slammed his hand against the table. I am not apologizing for losing to a fraud. But deep down, the humiliation burned more than the loss itself. Not because Emma was unworthy, but because what he'd seen, her stance, her precision, her calmness, was irrefutable evidence that she belonged on that range more than him. And even worse, she had carried her late husband into that duel in a way Blake could never match. It wasn't just marksmanship. It was something deeper. When the Boston police came knocking Monday morning with questions about criminal tampering and gaming fraud, Blake knew the narrative had slipped beyond his control. Investigators had already reviewed Rebecca's recordings, showing his advisor adjusting firearms. They were looking not only at sabotage, but also the legality of wagers involving tens of thousands, connected to charitable foundations. For the first time in decades, Blake Radcliffe had no press release that could smother the truth. The once untouchable champion now looked less like an icon, and more like a desperate man caught clinging to an image cracking apart. For Emma, the whirlwind settled differently. She had won, yes, but she carried no hunger for gloating. Her first instinct was to finalize Blake's original promise. 2 days later, she stood shaking hands with Colonel James Harrison, director of the Veteran Support Foundation. The money from Blake's sanction and fines had already doubled the initial $50,000 pledge. It meant new programs, new resources, more support for struggling brothers and sisters in arms. Harrison looked at her with an expression sharp with respect. Some of us on the board saw what you did, he said. It wasn't just the shooting. It was the resolve. If you're open to it, we'd like you involved in our new marksmanship therapy program. Veterans struggling with reintegration have found shooting to be not just skill, but healing. We want that program to grow. You could be part of it, Emma hesitated. For years, grief had made her a shadow of herself. She had never envisioned leading anything again. But she thought of Nathan's words, of his logbooks filled with lessons not just about firing, but about focus, patience, control. Maybe now they could live on beyond her own hands. Maybe through the hands of men and women who needed them as much as she once did. Quietly, she nodded. I'll do it. Weeks blurred into months and the headlines slowly evolved. The scandal waned. Blake faded into forced silence, and Emma, reluctantly at first, stepped into her new role. The Veteran Support Foundation now hosted weekly sessions with groups of wounded veterans, some carrying visible injuries, others carrying the invisible shrapnel of combat long after their uniforms were folded away. Emma stood at the range in front of them, no longer the quiet accountant shrinking into the background, but a teacher. She spoke softly. I'm not a soldier, not a champion. I am someone who learned that the steadiest hands often come from those who've been shaken hardest. Today we don't start with hitting targets. We start with how to stand, how to breathe, how to focus. She watched them gradually find alignment as she once had. Each shot they fired was a release of stress, of fear, of ghosts. For her, every click of the trigger sounded like reconciliation. Months later, during the foundation's fundraiser, Emma took the stage. She had never liked microphones or crowds, yet as she looked out at the sea of faces, veterans, families, donors, civilians, she felt rooted, anchored in purpose. 1 year ago, she began, I walked into a shooting range for the first time since my husband's funeral. I expected dust, grief, maybe closure. Instead, I found challenge, confrontation, and ultimately outer community. What started as a promise to one man has grown into something much larger. It belongs to all of us now. When she paused, volunteers unveiled a plaque with the inscription, the Nathan Ghost Miller Scholarship for Excellence in Marksmanship and Veteran Reintegration. For the first time in public, Emma let tears slide freely. It wasn't weakness. It was tribute. In the back of the room, Rebecca clapped the loudest. Michael Reeves leaned forward, his expression somewhere between pride and gratitude. And among those veterans now training because of the foundation, a young Army Ranger limped to the stage to accept the scholarship. His voice cracked as he said, "You gave me back my focus. You gave me back myself." As he held the plaque and the scholarship certificate, Emma toyed with her wedding ring once more, whispering silently, "This is for you, Nathan. For everything you taught me about staying steady." Blake Radcliffe's name, meanwhile, continued to appear in articles for all the wrong reasons. His records were under review, endorsements gone, and his suspension became indefinite. Without a spotlight to feed off, he withered into rumors, living proof that arrogance anchored in privilege cannot sustain real respect. For Emma, though, respect came not from proving Blake wrong, but from proving Nathan right, that she had the capacity, the peace, the discipline to carry his lessons onward. Walking the grounds of the Foundation's new training range, Emma often felt the grief still, and grief never leaves. But now it was softened, tempered by purpose. She could almost hear Nathan's gravelly whisper when she sighted over a target, almost feel his hand adjusting her shoulders when she coached a nervous veteran on their stance. She had lost her partner, but gained a mission, and that mission gave her back a life. Emma Miller, once invisible, underestimated, and dismissed as out of place, had become more than the widow of a fallen warrior. She had become a symbol of resilience. She wasn't loud, never would be. She would never fill Blake's kind of stages with roaring applause. Instead, she filled quiet spaces with impact, one steady lesson at a time, one veteran's life at a time. Her true championship wasn't the 10 bullseyes that crowned her that day, but the ripples of healing that spread outward from the calm at her core. Perhaps Emma's greatest victory wasn't defeating an arrogant champion, but rediscovering herself. Not erasing grief, but transforming it. Not living in the shadow of Nathan's achievements, but carrying his light forward into new lives. And for everyone watching her story unfold, for every person who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, talked down to, her journey carried a lesson clear as a gunshot echoing across the range. Never underestimate the quiet ones.